Another video to upset all you knife dorks. I might as well just start off and say that this is the best sharpener ever made. No, I'm not going to talk about that, but I will talk a little bit about pull-through sharpeners. Yes, they do work, contrary to the knife dorkdom out there that claims they don't. What I'm going to talk about today is the hunting application, the camping application, where these knives actually get used, and the problem that most people run into once they actually start using knives in the field, right? All these folks on YouTube that are knife guys, they don't actually talk about this, but if you're a hunter, you're a guide, you're a fisherman, you know, you're just somebody who uses a knife in the field on your backpack trips a whole lot, what you run into, regardless of the knife that you're using, is it gets duller quicker than you expected in the field, and then when you're in field conditions, you just have a hard time getting it back to that sharp edge. The hunter's dilemma. The exact example of this, every elk hunter, every deer hunter is going to run into this. Maybe they're halfway through the animal, maybe they're 3/4 of the way through the animal, but their knife starts to dull on them and they notice it. 70% of hunters, what they're going to do is they're going to continue to use that knife just to get through the project, right? Just to finish the animal, get the job done. That is a recipe for disaster. One, it's actually a very big safety issue. You know, if you're working on an elk in the backcountry, down in some shithole, it's usually dark when you're doing this. You may have good help, you may not have any help at all, but now you've got a dull knife. Anytime you start really putting pressure on an animal and you're on an unstable base, right? You're straddling a bull elk, or you know, the bull elk could be laying somewhere where the body could move as you work on it, right? In those sorts of situations, you want a super sharp knife. You want the knife to be as sharp as it was when you pulled it off your belt or you pulled it out of your pack. And the reason being is the minute you start putting pressure on that animal, on the cut, you run into the situation where you're gonna lose control, right? Lose your footing, the blade's gonna pop through the hide, it's gonna poke you, poke your buddy, do the horrible thing that we always worry about in the backcountry when we're straddling an elk, going straight into our femoral artery, going straight into a buddy that's helping us, right into his leg, something like that. That's gonna happen if your knife is dull. Outside of it just being dangerous, it's a pain in the ass, right? Like you've been working on the animal, you're exhausted, you wanna finish the job, and you don't wanna finish the job with a marginal tool. All right, so a bunch of you guys in the hunting community are yelling at the screen right now saying, this is why I use a Havalon, this is why I use XYZ replaceable blade knife. I agree. That's why there's a market of knives in the hunting world where you replace the blade on the knife. Here's my take on this, right? You're correct. If you don't know how to deal with the situation, you don't know how to keep a knife sharp in the field, potentially you don't know how to sharpen a knife from the beginning, replaceable blades will work. But just think about that. Think about you're an outdoorsman, you're a hunter, and you can't even sharpen a knife. That is like, if you want to talk about something historic in terms of, you know, being a hunter, sharpening a knife, you know, our ancestors in the hunting world could sharpen a knife on a rock. They didn't need to hit up Walmart or hit up Amazon.com to get replaceable blades. In my view, it's kind of the solution of incapable outdoorsman is what I would call it. It's so harsh. If you have no clue who I am, I don't blame you at all. My name's Cliff Gray. I guided and outfitted some of the most remote areas in North America. In the context of this video, I have field dressed hundreds of animals. I've used hundreds of different knives in that application. So what I'm gonna tell you on this subject, it's just based on that data set and it's what worked for me. So the first thing we have to do when our knife starts to get less useful, right? I'm not gonna call it dull quite yet because we gotta categorize it. We gotta figure out what's going on with our knife. The thing about that is in the field, we don't have a microscope. We're not in our basement. We're not in our shop. We can't see exactly what's going on with the burr, the apex of the edge, all of those sort of things. So we have to speculate in our mind what's going on so we can solve the problem. All right, so the obvious one is that your knife is just truly dull, right? The way you've used it on the animal, it's become dull. So there's a few things you want to be really careful on when you start using a knife, a fresh knife on a game animal, right? You want to limit this edge's exposure to dirt, hair, and bone. Those three things are going to dull your knife very quickly, right? And that's why you don't see people who are filleting fish sharpen their knives completely very often, right? Because most of the tissue that they're going through, even if they're going through rib cages on salmon or whatever, that's very, very soft material relative to big game animals. So when we're dealing with big game animals, we have to be careful of that. Even with high quality, harder steeled knives, if you abuse the way you go through an animal, you cut hair, you cut dirty hair, so the hair, particularly on the legs, is gonna dull into these knives very quickly, because it's not only the hardness of the hair, it's also the hardness of all the foreign material in there, right? All the dirt, all the grime, all the mud. I'm literally describing any bull elk's leg during the rut, right? He's gonna have been wallowing. He's gonna just basically have sandpaper in the hair. If you cut through that, it's gonna dull your knife. The next thing is on the joints, right? If you're removing the joints on the leg, you really gotta know where those are at. If you start to really score around, really put pressure on your blade against the bone as you're looking for those joints, you're gonna dull the knife pretty darn quickly. The other spot where this happens a lot is as you go into the ball joints of the hip of the animal. A lot of people will find that ball joint, and it's actually encapsulated in, you know, kind of like a cartilage. So as you go through that, that's not gonna dull your knife. What's gonna dull your knife is as you score that bone really hard and you use a lot of pressure. So you gotta lay off that and use a little technique. Try not to use a ton of pressure when you're around bone. Even if you're stripping off a back strap, right? Don't take your knife and go hard on the rib cage. Just feather along on that rib cage. As you get to the feather bones, instead of pushing hard against them and, you know, damn near trying to crack them, use your knife and your feel to go around those bones a little bit and stay off of them, so you're not constantly putting the edge against hard bone. And really, it's not just setting it on hard bone, it's pressure against hard bone. That's where you're gonna roll your edge, you're gonna create chips, all of that stuff, the stuff that really dulls your knife. So a lot of that is just about technique. The other obvious thing that people will do is they'll bring a knife with them hunting that's not super sharp from the get-go. Obviously, make sure your knife is sharp from the beginning so you get the longevity of the blade the whole way. Because it's exponential, right? You actually end up putting a whole lot more pressure against bone, more pressure against hair, all of that, if your edge is already dull. So this kind of ends up being, it's not a linear curve to dullness. It's actually exponential, right? We get a little dullness, we start putting more pressure, now all of a sudden we exponentially get quicker to the dullness mark, if that makes any sense. Not exactly a great mathematical way of explaining it, but I think you get the idea. One thing I have noticed that people do, they'll take a hunting knife, you know, this one here that I use quite often, one of these Montana Knife Company blades, and these are gonna come factory, you know, basically at like 18, 20 degrees, roughly something in that realm, right? That's gonna be a little more obtuse than, say, a fillet knife, right? Or a knife that's like that, because you want a bit of a working edge, almost a little bit of a, you know, not like a chopping edge like an axe, but somewhere in between, right? So 17 to 20 degrees, that's kind of what you're gonna see on hunting knives. Yeah, you know, you might see some that are at 15. I mean, we're kind of splitting hairs here, right? But that's the angle you're looking at. Now, what people will do is, if they really get into sharpening in the sense that they want to be shaving, you know, hair off their arms, a lot of times what they'll find is it's easier to create that type of, you know, hair splitting edge if you make the angle, the cutting angle of the knife more acute, right? So you get it thinner, and then you can get it, you know, where it feels so much sharper, so much quicker. So people will do that with their hunting knives just for the sake of having a sharp knife, right? The problem with that is that tightening of the edge makes the durability of the edge fall off really quickly. So just be careful of that. I've noticed that people will do that. I'll pick up somebody's hunting knife they're having trouble with. And on some of these knives, you can actually look at the bevel and you can just see, you know, you can see that, wow, like for the thickness of that spine of knife, that bevel is way too wide, meaning that they have a much more acute angle on the edge than seems normal. The other thing that you'll see people do, particularly if they're chasing a burr as they sharpen a knife, like they want to get a nice, really good coverage of a burr along the whole edge, which is actually a very good way to learn how to sharpen. They'll work one side of the knife really hard, work that burr up, right? And then they'll go to the other side of the knife and essentially just take that burr off. So on one side, you'll have, a big flat bevel. And when I say bevel, guys, I'm talking about the shiny part right there. I'm talking about the cutting bevel of this knife, right? So you can see this knife is black where it's not the cutting bevel, and then it's got the cutting bevel there, right? It's the thin cutting edge. So if you work a burr on that whole thing up on one side, and then the other side you just knock it off, you're actually going to have a big wide bevel on one side because you've taken a whole lot of metal off. And then on the other side that you didn't evenly do that to, you're going to have a much thinner bevel. So you end up with the same result, right? Because now you have thinning of that edge and you're going to lose durability because of that. So be wary of that. If you are freehand sharpening, just make sure, as kind of a gut check, that your bevel, your cutting bevel on your knife should be pretty equal on each side. Some people will argue that you actually just need to count, each swipe on a whetstone instead, because that'll keep that bevel even on each side and it'll keep your apex right down the middle. You guys can check out my sharpening video. I'll put a link up right here. The last sharpening video you'll ever have to watch. A little bit of a clickbait title, I suppose. But anyways, in that one, I described how I think about sharpening on whetstones. And I actually think it's much easier to just watch the bevel on each side to see that I'm sharpening and taking off equal amounts of metal on each side of the blade. We're not perfectly symmetrical people. One of my balls is lower than the other ball. One of my biceps is probably slightly larger than the other one, right? So the pressure that I put along that edge is gonna be different. So even if I count the swipes on the whetstone, doesn't necessarily mean I'm not gonna end up with a very lopsided edge. All right, so those things I've covered are really just about having a knife sharp in the first place, the durability of the knife. Now, the thing is, with modern knives, particularly if you're like mid-tier knives to higher end knives, this knife, this is a $100 knife, this is a $300 knife. When you're in that realm and the hardness of those steels, you really shouldn't have to worry about this part of it too much, right? Most of these knives, if you're somewhat cautious about how you do your field dressing, depending on the knife, depending on the situation, if the animal's hanging up or it's laying on its side in the field, depending on all those different situations, you probably should still be able to get 3/4 of the way through most big game animals, if not completely through big game animals. So this doesn't explain why our knife is starting to get dull 1/4 of the way through a whitetail, halfway through a mule deer, 10 minutes into an elk. Why is our blade getting dull? If that's your situation, like you have a razor sharp knife when you start on a big game animal, but in really short order, all of a sudden your knife's dull, most likely your knife actually wasn't sharp. So let me explain this. You're telling me right now, no, I've got bald spots on my arm from shaving with it. I've been cutting paper like all the YouTubers. That thing was sharp. Well, what happens? Well, before I explain what happens, I would ask you a question, right? After you sharpen your knife, if you're using whetstones, you're using pull-through sharpeners, whatever sharpener you're using, right? Are you doing something to strip the burr off the edge? So that could be a ceramic rod, right? And it could be, light forward strokes, or ideally it's reverse kind of stropping or stroping strokes, however you want to call it, right? But, that light stroping stroke is going to pull that burr off. The other thing that'll weaken a burr and basically get it to fall off on its own on a lot of these steels is just to slowly go down the grades of grit, right, on whetstone or whatever sharpener you're using. As you go finer and finer, that burr's basically going to fall off on its own. The thing is, a lot of us hunters, we get it sharp after, the coarse stone or the medium stone, and we're like, man, that thing's getting pretty sharp. I can shave with it. It feels pretty good. I don't need to do anything else. I don't need to go down the stones. I don't need to strop it. I'm impatient. It's all good. I've got a sharp knife. If that's you, most likely what you have on your knife is you have a standing burr along the edge, and that's what's sharp. The actual edge, the actual bevels, there, the cutting bevels and the apex they form, that is actually not well sharpened yet. You have a half-ass sharpened edge with a straight up burr that's really sharp in itself, right? So that burr can cut hair, can rip right through paper. That's what you're noticing. The thing is, immediately when you get into big game animals or you get into a camping application where you start to test the durability of that edge on your knife, that burr starts to fall off and you get immediate dullness to your knife if that's the case. Your knife's actually just dull, but that's one that can be very frustrating to guys. I talked to a lot of guys that are like, man, I got a $500 knife, I sharpen it, and within 10 minutes on an elk, it's dull. It's probably not the knife, it's probably you not removing that burr. But in a minute here, I'll show you how to avoid that. All right, so the third situation is the one that people who are cognizant of, staying ahead of the knife getting dull, right? The guys that are on board on sharpening early and often, right? These guys, the issue that they run into, right, where they keep trying to hone the knife back, but it's just not coming back, they think they're in this category, right? And that's a honeable knife category. Now, it is possible that you could be in a honeable knife category in the hunting application, but generally, because of all the harsh things I've talked about relative to knife edges in the hunting world, a lot of times we just pop right past this, particularly on hard steel, high quality hunting knives. We don't notice any dullness, any performance issues until the knife is dull and really not honeable anymore. If you're using a Victorinox knife in the field, like a boning knife or a paring knife from those guys, we're talking about knives that are $10, $20, $30, then this can be very relevant to you. And you'll see in my videos, I'm not saying that's a bad idea. There's a lot of situations where I just do that. If an animal's hanging, a lot of times I will solely use those type of knives because they're really utilitarian to get meat off an animal, right? But they have some disadvantages for just pure field work. But if you have those soft steel knives, you're gonna notice them get dull pretty quickly just on the fact that the metal's soft. And when you notice that, immediately start honing them, right? You can hone them on a ceramic rod like this Edge Pro. I'll also put a link down below of a honing rod, a ceramic honing rod that I really like that's on Amazon. It's a little thicker and it's pretty easy to use. I like that one also. But in that case, yes, you can hone that soft blade up because you'll catch it early because you'll feel the performance issues. And really what you're honing up is not cracks or chips in the edge. What you're honing up is some waviness, slight rolling of the edge. You can hone those things up fairly quickly and that'll work. You can also use this Ultratek sharpener that I like to use. It's very compact, but ideally if you're using those type of knives, use one of these that's got some of the diamond kind of used off of it. I use these a lot, and basically I have an older one and a newer one, right? I've actually got a bunch of these, but if you look at these, you guys can probably see, this one here has got most of the diamond rubbed off of it. So you can feel the texture difference. So really, this one is like a honing rod. It's been used quite a bit, right? And so I can hone soft metal knives on it, and I still have that nice utility of it being small. It's got a nice handle, whereas this one that still has some diamond grit on it, it's gonna be a little aggressive for those soft steel knives. Still gonna work, but it's gonna remove a little more metal than you really need. A ceramic rod is really where it's at on that situation. Victorinox actually sells a pretty cool little packable ceramic rod also that you can whip those knives right back up into shape on. All right, so now we're gonna go beyond that exception. That's what I'm gonna call it. That's the exception that your knife is actually honeable. A lot of us are trying to hone up our knives mid-animal, but they're just usually dull. They're beyond honeable knives at that point. So what solutions do we have that we can do to solve this dilemma? One, we can actually just full on put a new edge on the knife. We could use something like this. This is Work Sharp's field sharpener. Pretty lightweight, has everything we need to be able to do that, right? We can put it down, we can use the angle guides on here, and we can just put that full edge back onto our hunting knife. And then, as I mentioned just a second ago, this Ultratek sharpener from Kershaw, a new one, you can put a new complete edge on the knife, right? The whole bevel, you can sharpen the whole bevel. So this is where I gotta get into something, right? Because the thing about this is it's hard to do in field conditions, and that's what hunters run into, and that's why guys that have been hunting quite a while, they don't even try it, right? Because you know you're in low light conditions a lot of the times. You've got blood all over your hands. You've got tallow on your hands. You've got tallow along the edge, all over the knife. To sit and hold the angle, even in this really cool work sharp deal that has the guides, but you know you get into this and you're really trying to hold that angle and put that exact 18-degree edge on there that you had across the whole bevel. It's really hard. The other thing is we got hard steeled, high quality hunting knives, a lot of us. So it's hard to do that because we're taking off the whole bevel. Let me show you guys this here. That thing smells good. Edge, knife edge, right? Okay, this top part right here, that's the cutting bevel, right? So if you look at this knife, it's the shiny part on the top here, right? That's actually doing the cutting. So if we're gonna put the whole edge on there, we actually have to consistently hold that whole edge on whatever sharpening tool we have, right? So it really doesn't matter what it is, but it's gotta have something that can remove metal. It's gotta be something beyond the honing tools that I showed you. So the Ultratek sharpener, or a newer one that's got some diamond grit on it, the Work Sharp field sharpener, that'll work for sure. Something unique like this hoof knife sharpener. I don't have any here, but a lot of times I'll use DMT paddles, the little diamond paddles. Those things do not work well if they're dirty. They're the worst. And honestly, that's a big issue here with this, right? Is that the filth that you're dealing with, the hair, the fat, the blood on your hands and the sharpener. It does a couple things, right? One, it just makes it hard to hold that angle. The other thing is it lubricates the abrasive material, right? So the diamond grit, you know, whatever you're using to take that metal off, it's being lubricated by the fat, so it makes it very hard to do. And then this idea, the fact we're taking the whole bevel down, makes it even harder to do, right? So in general, I don't recommend it. Most people are gonna have a hard time doing that in the field. Everyone. I don't know that I've ever seen anybody that can really, you know, whip up a, you know, dull as dull knife back to sharp, standing right over an elk. It's damn near impossible. So what I recommend is you figure out how to micro bevel your knife. First off, I got a whole video on micro beveling. I'll stick the link up right here. Go check it out. I'm gonna give you short and sweet right now. All right, so instead of sharpening the entire cutting bevel, we're going to sharpen half of it or a third, whatever, right? So just that part I colored in, right? So the advantage you have here is, one, you don't have to hold the angle perfectly, and I'll explain to you why in a second. The other thing is you don't have to remove as much material. You don't have to remove the whole bevel, so it's easier just physically to do that, right? Particularly if you're dealing with dirty surfaces, lubricated surfaces. Now, the other thing is you're going to do it a little more obtuse angle because that's what this geometry does, right? So if you're off on one, the other one a little bit, like no big deal, right? Like it's not the end of the world. Micro beveling your knife will get a knife sharp enough to get through the rest of the animal typically. So when I talk about micro beveling, I'm also going to talk about two sharpeners that you guys hate, or the internet hates, and that's pull through sharpeners and these little Corona tool sharpeners. So absolutely, the carbide on these takes metal off of knives real quick. You can take the life of a knife off really quick if you chronically sharpen them with these devices, right? In general, not solely because you might hit the angle perfectly, but in general, when you run a knife through one of these cheap pull-through knife sharpeners, you're actually micro beveling the knife, right? That angle in there is actually more obtuse than your standard angles on these knives. So you stick it in there, you pull on it, it's gonna strip metal off, and it's basically micro beveling the knife. These work best on soft metal knives because of the quality of the carbide and the hardness of the carbide. If that carbide is the same hardness as your knife, because you got a high quality knife, then your edge is going to be really ragged. It will get usable still, but it's going to be really ragged because there's going to be some chips in there that are created by the pull through, that sort of thing. But if you've got really good carbide in the pull through sharpener, which is rare, or you have a little bit softer knife, these things will actually sharpen a knife up pretty damn good by doing that micro beveling. With this deal, this little Corona tool, which is very packable, you can take this and you can micro bevel freehand with it, right? This thing pulls off metal like crazy, and you can micro bevel a knife easy with this. And I would say that in the spectrum of dirty knives, fat covered knives, stuff like that, this is one of the easiest ways to micro bevel a knife. Practice beforehand though, because there's no guards, there's nothing like that. This thing just strips metal off and you can run your hand right into the blade. Pretty easy to do it this way away. This way you gotta be cautious, right? I would say that historically, the quickest and easiest way to micro bevel a knife was to do it with something like this that was just fairly harsh, right? It's gonna take some metal off your knife pretty quick. Of course, you can use the other abrasive materials that I've talked about. I talk in the micro beveling video, you can do all that. But the Work Sharp sharpener, the ceramic rod on this field sharpener actually micro bevels your knife. So if you have a knife that is probably beyond honing, right? You've run it a little bit too far. A lot of people would think, well, that ceramic rod won't work on the Work Sharp sharpener because that's for honing. Well, one, ceramic it does take some metal off, right? That's a falsehood out there that people put out there. It does remove metal, but this Work Sharp ceramic rod, the angle guides on it, this says 20 degrees, right? These are all at 20 degrees, which is kind of a standard, and you could put your knives, if you're going to use this, just put all your knives at 20, so this tool, which is an awesome tool, is even more useful. But that ceramic rod is actually at 25 degrees, which means that if you come in here and you put your knife on that's at 20, and you use that ceramic rod and you put a little more pressure on it than you would if you were honing, and you do more strokes than you were honing, you will get your knife sharp. And that's a really easy way to do it over a dead elk, right? Because this thing you can hold out here. You don't have this thing where you're going to ram your hand into the blade. You can hold it out here and you can micro bevel your knife. Okay, that's what's going on here. A lot of people think, oh, there's something special about that material. They use a high, no, it has nothing to do with that. It's all about the angle, and they make that very easy to do, and you can do it a bunch of times, and that will get your knife sharp. Whereas, honing it on a bare ceramic rod is not going to do that, because you're never going to, or most people are never going to think to put that really steep angle on there as they go against that ceramic rod. They're more thinking about honing, laying up the rolled edge or something like that. This is actually, it's actually sharpening. It's removing metal at that angle, and that's going to bring a dull knife back alive fairly quickly. All right, so that basically wraps up my thoughts on micro beveling a knife. I do it a lot when I'm hunting, but I want to leave you guys with some really important takeaways. They're in that other video, but I'll say them here also. Micro beveling cannot be your style of sharpening. People will start to do that because they notice that it works on their knives, right? They've been so frustrated they cannot sharpen their own hunting knives, and then all of a sudden they use more pressure at a higher angle and they start getting their knife sharp. But over time, because there's some angle edge dynamics going on there, it actually becomes less and less effective on a knife that doesn't get the whole edge, not just that micro bevel, the whole edge redone. Usually for me, one micro bevel that night, I'll go sharpen the knife in camp properly. So next time I micro bevel the knife, that micro bevel technique actually works. That is a key component of this. If you don't do that, if you just micro bevel your knife and say, okay, my knife is sharp now, you're gonna run into problems. So don't do that. You always have to consider it a 1 or 2 time solution, right? To get you through the animal, use that steeper angle, use Work Sharp's steeper angle on there to get that micro bevel on your knife. The other thing to consider, that if you're using one of these cheap pull-throughs or the Corona kind of tool sharpener to micro bevel your knife, you're taking off a lot of metal. That's just how these things operate. You're taking off a lot of metal. So when you go in to re-sharpen the knife properly and fully to get it back to kind of its default setting, when you do that, you got to pull quite a bit of metal off the knife to get it down to that micro bevel, back to the full angle. Again, look at my micro bevel video and you'll know what I'm saying. If you use these type of aggressive sharpeners, they will fairly quickly change the profile of the knife's edge, right? So really, in a sense, they're gonna cut down the longevity of your knife if you use these a lot. So my general recommendation is use this idea here with the Work Sharp field sharpener. Just buy one of these. I'll put a link down below, but you could do this with a bare ceramic rod also. Just use a heavier angle. But I'm going to talk about the next aspect of this, which is really going to convince you to buy one of these anyway. And as of this video, these guys don't sponsor me or anything like that. The thing is, I'm not usually into gear that tries to solve a bunch of different problems and really is not great at solving any of those problems. It's just mediocre at solving all of those problems. I usually like specialized high quality gear. And that overarching theory kind of made me not want to like this field sharpener from Work Sharp, but this thing is pretty dang good at micro beveling a knife, as I just mentioned, re-edging a knife, putting a full sharp bevel on the knife, and making sure there's no burr on that edge, right? So I can micro bevel the knife halfway through an elk, and then I can get into camp and I can re-put the edge on there and strip the burr off it and have a perfect edge so I don't run into the problem I mentioned earlier on where I've got an edge that's mimicking sharpness, right? I can do all of that on this sharpener. So let me run you through that real quick. What I would do, assuming this knife is micro beveled, I'd go on the coarse side. I wouldn't alternate at first. I would just run up a full burr on one side of my edge, and then I would go on the other side, and I would take that burr off and push, well, really not take the burr off, I'd push it to the other side, right? And I'd be watching the side of my cutting bevel as I did that. Then I'd flip it over, I'd go to my finer plate here, a lot of times on the finer plate because I just don't want to bother with trying to find that smaller burr on these knives. I'll count my swipes and try to be very even on it. And then what I'll do at this point, instead of re-micro beveling my knife on the ceramic rod, I actually will just use that ceramic rod to strope, whatever you want to call it. Backward strokes on that, and then I'll go over to the actual strop that's on here, little piece of leather they have, and I'll do several strokes on each side on the leather. The nice thing about the leather is that for me, if there's a burr on there that I left, depending on the knife, you know, knives burr up in very different ways. A lot of times on the leather, you're gonna notice it kind of hangs up on the leather, right? Whereas sometimes on the other material, you don't notice it. So that seems kind of hokey to some people. Like, why not just strop off on the ceramic rod, you know, or even on a fine plate? Like, you can get rid of the burr that way. Yeah, that's all good, but that leather is pretty nice to use if you just want to make sure that there's no burr on that edge, right? So you do all that, and then you test the sharpness of your knife, and you're actually going to go into the field the next day, in my situation, because I'm always so anal about this and do this in camp at night, but you're going to go into the field the next day with an actual sharp knife, doesn't have a burr on it. It's going to get you through the vast majority of an animal, if not the whole animal, if you're smart how you use the blade. If it doesn't do that for you and you need to sharpen the blade in the field, just micro bevel it right on that ceramic rod with the steeper angle and you're good to go. So this item is a great solution, but at the same time, it helped me explain several different topics to you that I think if you understand those and you understand what I went over, you're never going to have that same issue where you're frustrated and you have to push through an animal in an unsafe way, in a frustrating way. You don't have to do that. You're going to be able to sharpen up the knife and have a good tool in your hand to the very end. I'm sending you off with the micro bevel video here. How many times have I mentioned this thing? But there you go. I think it's very useful to just further your understanding of this concept. If you enjoyed this content, do me a huge favor and like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'll catch you guys later.